We are very familiar, I suspect, with the broad outlines of the story of Jonah, the prophet. Its central mystery is Jonah's flight from God. The whole story is haunted by Jonah fleeing. We would all agree, I think, that to try to avoid God is impossible because God is by definition omnipresent and omniscient. God is everywhere and always everywhere. So how can you flee from God? It's actually a theological absurdity. The only way to run from God is to become unconscious of the God who is with us all the time, outside of me and inside of me, within me. It's to become unaware, almost intentionally forgetting about God. Jonah wants to avoid God because of who God is, and that is that he cannot really all the way know him. He cannot control him. He's haunted by him. We all, at one time or another, try to avoid God. We all find ways to be unconscious and unaware, especially if it's about something we don't want to let ourselves see. Cry out. That is God's command to Jonah. Cry out. God commands Jonah to go to this great city whose evil is crying out to God. And Jonah is to cry out there to them, to turn from their evil ways. But Jonah turns and goes in the exact opposite direction, as far as he can go from that city. And his fleeing creates a storm everywhere around him and actually also within him. A terrible storm inside of himself. A great fear in all those around him and a great fear inside of him. That's what happens to us too when we try to remain unconscious and unaware. When we try not to see what life or God are prodding us to see. We become unsettled. We become diseased. It can lead to a fear and it can lead to a despair so great that in the end we would wish ourselves dead. And so Jonah begins his awful descent. Most of the verbs in the story are all about descent, carrying him downward into a stupor. He went down to his city. He went down into the ship. He went down into the ship's hold where he laid down and fell asleep. This is a withdrawal from consciousness. His trajectory is downward. And as if that wasn't far enough down, he offers himself to his fellow sailors and asks them to throw him into the sea. There, into the depths of the sea, down into the great fish. It almost sounded like it was brave, but actually Jonah was still fleeing. This was just another way to flee. And finally, Jonah expresses the full toxicity of his flight. And now, O God, please take my life, for my death is better than life. Jonah becomes suicidal. The sailors in this storm, the sailors come to Jonah and they cry out. They cry out to Jonah in the very words God cried out to Jonah to do in this first reading we heard today, which is to stand up and cry out to your God. How can you be sleeping? Cry out. His flight becomes a withdrawal from even himself, from his own voice into his own depths. The depth of the sea is a metaphor for his spiritual anguish. Jonah can go down into the depths without touching the core of the mystery of his own soul. He's unable to find his voice. He's unable to cry out. He's unable to express his fear. In a sense, he's sleepwalking his way through all the adventures of his life. And so Jonah, in the anguish of his soul, falls into a deep sleep. And the captain of the ship comes to him and says, "Behold, we are standing between death and life, and you are sound asleep." Would that someone would rouse us to remind us of just that. That we are standing between death and life, and we're sound asleep. My fellow human beings, this is an existential place. You and I are always standing between death and life. And it's standing there that we have to learn to cry out. Every prayer has got to be about standing between death and life and crying out. Not escaping into a stupefied sleep or a form of prayer that leads us to a complacency and an unconscious life. Here, finally, is the core of Jonah's flight. To flee from God is to refuse to stand between death and life. It's the refusal to cry out from that standing place. The opposite of flight from God is, in a word, prayer. The opposite of fleeing from God is to stand and pray. It's just to stand our ground in this human place between death and life and cry out. Standing is the essential posture of prayer that was so visible when so many of us went on pilgrimage a year ago, getting home just about a week ago now, a year ago, just before the pandemic, to pray with the Jewish people, to stand at what we call the Wailing Wall, they call the Western Wall, and to see them standing there, some of them in tears, rocking back and forth with their body, standing, crying out. It's the essential posture of prayer. But for Jonah, it was unbearable. And sometimes, too often for us, unbearable for us. And so, like Jonah, we sink into unconsciousness, suppressing that human cry. To flee, then, is the opposite of to stand. It's an attitude of alert responsiveness. T.H. Lawrence wrote, "The human person in his wholeness, wholly, H-O-L-Y, attending. The human person in his wholeness, wholly attending." Not standing, evading that stance is to deny our vulnerability. It's to avoid it once again. It's to prefer death to the anguish of this human place in between. The heart of standing is you cannot flee. Jonah flees. He flees. Fear leads him to deny his own fear. And so Jonah chooses death. He turns to the sea. He turns towards the depth. Marianne Moore writes in a poem, I think it's a poem called A Grave. It is human nature to stand in the middle of a thing, but you cannot stand in the middle of this. The sea has nothing to give but a well-excavated grave. It advances as usual, looking as if it were not that ocean in which trapped things are bound to sink, in which if they turn and twist, it is neither with volition nor consciousness. She could have, she might have written that about this very book. You see, everyone at some point flees from life. There's so many things we don't want to let ourselves think about. Jonah is everyone. This is our human pathology, a pathology with which we are largely unconscious, and it leads to death. This territory is too familiar to us because of this moment in history. It's so real. How many days during this pandemic did I stand in the window of my room upstairs, a window that opens up to the world, or some hilltop hiking around Missouri, and look out at the world from there, from that window, from that hilltop, and really find myself crying out. Yes, crying out. Help us. Every human being is suffering this pandemic. Help. The nature of Jonah's fear relates to his refusal of standing place in God's presence. He refuses to straddle that place between death and life. Someone wrote, "The cost of wanting is the fear of losing what you have received." Therefore, my friends, the core of prayer is wishing, it's asking for the fulfillment of some need we have. If we cannot hang there for just a second and let ourselves feel it for a second and let ourselves express it in a cry to God, we will never pray. Really pray. Oh, I know we say thank you a lot, and thanks is a powerful prayer. But thanks is always looking to the past and discerning the gift. If our prayer does not include pleading, interceding, crying out to God, we will not meet God in this moment. Crying out has an urgent quality to it, and Jonah's prayer has no urgency. Jonah's allergic to reminders of his human vulnerability. He can't let himself go there. He's allergic to his fears. He's fleeing from his fears. Have we developed an allergy to that place so raw? When we stand and cry out, we are standing between death and life. Whether we're crying out for my own good, for our own good, crying out because of some unmet need, whatever it is, crying out for our own good, or crying out for the good of someone we dearly love, or crying out for our nation while we're watching the news 2.5 weeks ago now, with our mouths gaping open in stupefied terror as we watched on the news our nation's capital being breached for the first time in over 200 years, not by a foreign enemy, but by our fellow citizens. We cannot, you and I, we cannot inoculate ourselves to our own suffering or to the suffering of the world, and in particular, the suffering of our dear ones. As your priest, I cannot pray for you. When you ask me to pray for you for something of your life, I cannot pray for you without mustering the courage to stand in that place between death and life and wanting with you something you want, something for you, wanting something for you so badly that you do not have, that I can only cry out from that standing place for you in your name to God. I owe you nothing less than that as your priest. When I was a young priest, so many people would ask for prayers, and I would just rattle them off to God before I went to bed, like a litany of thoughts, like a checklist. But when I say I will pray for you, I mean I will stand in that place between what you want and your lack and its completion, and feel that lack with you. When someone asks you to pray for them, can you do any less? You see, the force that draws us to the very heart of prayer is need. It's a wish, unfulfilled. It's a desire. The human emptiness that yearns to be filled. Prayer is the expression of human life in time with all the contingencies of need. Whether we pray for sustenance, health, family, forgiveness, it is precisely the experience of lack that thrusts us into this vulnerable place of standing and asking, standing and crying out. I don't know if you notice it when we pray formally together, but formal prayers in the Jewish and Catholic tradition begin with praise and end with thanks. But the middle piece, the essence, is asking for the fulfillment of our needs or someone's needs. One who lacks nothing is by that fact barred from prayer. Remember, the heart of standing is you cannot flee. The power of need, poverty, lack is to create a space of dynamic intimacy with God. The emptiness is transformed into this open vessel for receiving that still eludes our grasp. We are claimed by God right there. Out of the depths I cry out to you, O God. Out of the depths I cry out to you, we sang in that responsorial psalm. Out of the depths I cry out to you. Crying out from this place of reality, we transform pain into intimacy with God. In our dis-ease, we sustain the depth of need that opens up within us. This is not a passive thing, my friends. It's an exquisitely attentive one. Who is the one who must ask? Who must cry out? It is the human, for the human alone is capable of asking. The human asks, and it is for this reason that the lips of the human have been unsealed. To ask, to pray, is the most human thing. Our human nature requires speech when it asks. Prayer awakens us to us. Come help me, O Lord, for the waters have risen to my throat. Come help me, O Lord. Come help my sister, my friend, because the waters of her life have risen to her throat. Or in the mouth of Jesus from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you? Indeed, the human is confronted by his or her need again and again. As we go forward from that standing place, from our prayer, standing in the presence of God and crying out, we become part of the world. We actually become human. Out of the depths, I cry out to you, O God. It's what we do. It's what Jonah should have done.